tree line stopped making noise before the movement started. That was the only warning he was going to get. In a jungle that never went quiet, insects, birds, the constant percussion of moisture through triple canopy, white noise that had been running beneath everything for 11 hours. A silence that sudden meant one thing. He pressed his face into the mud and went still. His spotter, 4 meters to his left, had already heard it. Neither man breathed. Both listened. Boots. Not distant, not cutting across undergrowth on a patrol line running perpendicular to the thicket, moving directly toward the position where 2 men had been lying flat since before dawn. 8 feet, maybe 10. The M40 rifle beside him was not the weapon for this. It had been built for the 800-meter shot, the engagement that ended before the man on the receiving end understood it had started. At 8 feet, in the dark, with no room to bring a 24-inch barrel to bear, it was the wrong instrument at the wrong distance. He drew the pistol from the holster on his right hip, thumb to safety. Stillness. What he held was a weapon the Pentagon had declared obsolete, that the Army had replaced, that every branch of the United States military had been ordered to phase out in favor of something newer. Still here. Still loaded. Still the only answer to the problem that was 8 feet away and getting closer. In 1985, the United States military made a decision that was, by every available metric, the correct one. The M1911A1 pistol, John Browning's masterwork, the .45 caliber sidearm that had served American soldiers through 2 world wars, Korea, and the jungles of Vietnam, was declared obsolete. The weapon replacing it was the Beretta Model 92, redesignated the M9, chambered in 9mm NATO. The logic was not weak. The Cold War still organized American military planning around a single primary scenario: a Soviet armored push through the Fulda Gap, a conventional fight on the plains of Germany where interoperability and logistics would determine the outcome. 9mm was the NATO standard cartridge. The British carried it, the French, the Belgians, the Italians carried it. If an American soldier needed to share ammunition with an Allied unit during a Soviet breakthrough, 9mm worked. .45 ACP did not. And the Beretta was not a compromised weapon. 15 rounds in the magazine compared to 7 in the 1911. Lighter, with less recoil, and faster recovery between shots. It had passed a 171,000 round competitive evaluation against multiple designs and won on the merits. The men who chose it were not careless. They were solving the problem they had been given: a standard sidearm for a force preparing for the war the intelligence picture said was coming. The problem was that some of the men who would actually draw this pistol were not preparing for that war. They were already in a different fight entirely. Marine Scout Sniper doctrine was built on a single premise: 2 men, inserted covertly, who will not be found. Not might not, not typically will not. The doctrine was written as though discovery was an impermissible outcome, a contingency so serious that the entire operational model was built to prevent it. Teams moved at night, set their positions before first light, held through the hours of maximum exposure without sound or movement, and extracted after dark. Their primary weapon, the M40 precision rifle, was purpose-built for engagement distances where stealth had already done its job. The 800-yard shot, the target that ceased to function before the sound of the discharge arrived. The pistol in that doctrine was an acknowledgement, not a conventional backup, an acknowledgement that the doctrine had an exposed side. Sniper teams got found. Not often. The training was designed to make it rare, but often enough that the Marine Corps had built specific doctrine around the contingency. How to break contact from a compromised position at close range. How to get 2 men out of a situation where the operational geometry had inverted and the hunters were now the hunted. When a hide site was blown, when a patrol dog caught a scent, or a villager looked at the wrong patch of ground for half a second too long, or a rain pattern shifted the vegetation and exposed what had been invisible. There was no calling for supporting fire, no falling back to a squad, no element to provide cover. There were two men, a blown position, and whatever was on their person at the moment of contact. At that moment, range was not measured in hundreds of yards. It was the width of a room, the distance across a courtyard, the gap between two rows of vegetation in the dark, the distance at which the M40 became not a weapon, but a liability. Too long, too slow, incompatible with the geometry of what was about to happen. What they needed at that range was not suppression and not capacity. A single round that ended the problem. Immediately. Without a second attempt. John Browning had not designed the 1911 to penetrate. He had designed it to stop. The distinction was not philosophical. The Army had understood it in 1904 when they commissioned the cartridge built around that principle. The Thompson-Lagarde tests of that year evaluated every available pistol caliber against a single criterion: immediate incapacitation. The tests were crude by any rigorous standard, conducted largely on cattle rather than under controlled scientific conditions, and criticized for their methodology for decades afterward. But they captured something the Army had already witnessed in the Philippines under actual combat: that a wounded man with sufficient resolve could close the distance and kill the man who shot him before going down. The answer Browning built was not fast. A 230-grain projectile moving at 830 feet per second does not behave like a rifle round. It does not pass cleanly through a target and continue downrange. It decelerates rapidly in tissue and transfers energy differently than a faster, lighter round. Whether that consistently produces a more immediate stop than 9mm ball is a debate that has never been fully settled. Inside the Marine Scout Sniper community, it was not a debate. The 45 ACP carried a confidence earned over decades of use. And in the scenario the doctrine was built around, one chance at close range with no backup, that confidence was the calculation. The 1911's trigger was built on the same philosophy as the cartridge: single action. A clean break at 4.5 pounds. Nothing added to slow it down in the name of safety. A trigger built for the man who had already made the decision. 7 rounds in the magazine. A 2-man team with a compromised position was not trying to suppress a platoon. They were trying to produce immediate incapacitation sufficient to stop forward movement and buy seconds. The 1911 gave them what that calculation required. Not capacity, certainty. The Marine Corps maintained and refined these weapons specifically for this mission set. Armorers at Quantico fitted barrels and stone trigger groups and matched slides to frames at tolerances the original military specification had never required, building not a factory gun, but a fitted instrument for the exact contingency those men were trained around. When the order came down in 1985 to transition to the M9, the units built around that calculation did not comply in full. They submitted objections through the chain of command. They documented their requirements. They requested exemptions. And they kept their pistols. The proof came in stages, and the first stage arrived not from combat, but from a place almost as unambiguous: a military testing range, under conditions specifically designed to prevent exactly this. In 1987, 2 years after the M9 had entered service, a slide failure in Navy Special Warfare testing injured an operator. The mechanism was documented. The M9 slide could fracture at a specific stress point near the barrel hood when a round fired fractionally out of battery, the detonation occurring while the slide was still thousandths of an inch from its fully forward position. When the metal failed under that pressure spike, the slide did not go forward, into the berm or the target. It went backward, into the face of the man who had trusted the weapon. Additional failures surfaced in further evaluation. The cause was disputed. Beretta attributed the fractures to overloaded government ammunition, while Army engineers pointed to the slide material itself. But the result was not in dispute. For a weapon certified through 171,000 rounds of qualification testing, the design had to be modified. Beretta added a retention mechanism to capture a fracture before it could fragment, and the procurement continued. The Army declared it solved. In the Scout sniper platoons that had never fully transitioned to the M9, the reaction was not satisfaction and not anger. It was the specific absence of surprise, the recognition that comes from expecting something and watching it arrive. The argument the Scout sniper community had been making since 1985 was never about metallurgy. It was about what the failure meant in the operational context those men actually inhabited. A weapon drawn at 8 feet, when the team behind it had no backup and no alternative, could not be one that sent fragments into the face of the man holding it. There was no acceptable version of that outcome. The 1987 incidents confirmed what the evaluation had not captured: that the standard being applied to the M9 was not the standard that mattered to the men for whom the pistol was not a secondary consideration, but a final one. The complete argument was made in November of 2004, in the streets of Fallujah, the kind of city where theoretical arguments don't survive the first room. Operation Phantom Fury, designated Al-Fajr, the second battle for the city, was the largest urban combat operation American forces had conducted since Hue City in 1968. Regimental Combat Team 1 and Regimental Combat Team 7 fought through a city of 50,000 people that had been converted block by block and building by building into a layered defensive architecture designed to absorb and destroy them. Streets seeded with IEDs, structures connected by breaches blown through shared walls, allowing insurgents to move between buildings without entering the open. No defined front line, every threshold a decision. The Marine Scout sniper teams attached to those regiments moved through the city in pairs. Their M40 rifles, built for the 800-meter engagement, for the distance where physics and patience and discipline converge into a single shot, were incompatible with rooms that measured 15 feet across. Primary weapons became secondary. Slings adjusted. And what those teams drew in those rooms was not the M9. It was the MUSOC 1911, hand-built at Quantico's Weapons Training Battalion, fitted barrels and hand-stoned trigger groups. Assembled to a specification the M9 procurement had never been asked to meet. The Marine Corps had been building these pistols since the late 1980s for the expeditionary units designated Special Operations Capable, and for the elements attached to them, the units whose requirements the standard procurement had never been asked to address. In those rooms in Fallujah, the weapon performed the way the design had always intended, because the problem it was built to solve had not changed. It had simply waited for a city that left no room to argue otherwise. The institutional response to the Scout sniper community's objections had always run the same way. The M9 met the standard. The M9 was the standard. The standard was not open to unit-level reinterpretation. What that response could not accommodate was the metric the standard had not been built to measure: the probability of immediate incapacitation from a single round, at contact range, by a two-man element with no support. That metric had not been omitted through negligence. The evaluation was designed for a general-purpose force, and a two-man sniper team a mile from the nearest friendly unit is not that. The evaluation answered the question it was built to answer, not the one the Scout snipers were living. The gap, the general sidearm built for the whole force, and the specific weapon required for a different one, is the distance no procurement process built around standardization can cross. Standardization solves for the average. It cannot solve for the exception. And a two-man element with no support is exactly what no standard was built for. Beretta built a capable pistol. The Marine Corps never disputed that. The objection was to trading specific adequacy for general adequacy and declaring the trade acceptable for everyone, including the men for whom the pistol was not a secondary consideration, but a final one. In 2012, the Marine Corps formally adopted the Colt M45A1 close-quarter battle pistol, issuing it to Marine Forces Special Operations Command, Force Reconnaissance Companies, and Marine Special Reaction Teams. It was chambered in .45 ACP. By every design principle and mechanical lineage, it was a 1911. 27 years after the Pentagon declared the 1911 obsolete, the Marine Corps built it back into the standard issue equipment of its most specialized operators. Not from nostalgia, not from institutional resistance to change, because the question the 1911 answered had not been superseded. The question of what a two-man team needs when the range is 8 feet and there is no one coming has had the same answer since before the First World War. There is a version of military history that treats weapons adoption as a series of linear improvements, each platform superior to the last, each procurement decision representing institutional learning. That version is clean, and it is largely wrong. What the Marine Scout snipers understood, what the MUSOC program had been building into hand-fitted pistols since the 1980s, and what the M45A1 finally made official, is that the question determines the answer. If the question is NATO standardization and magazine capacity and follow-up shot recovery time, the M9 wins. Those are legitimate questions with real consequences for real soldiers. But if the question is what happens to two men alone when the moment arrives that the doctrine was built to prevent, a moment that was true in the jungle and true in Fallujah and is true wherever two men work without backup, the answer has been 45 ACP for more than a century. The Marine Corps never forgot that. They simply had to wait for the institution to remember why. If this is the history you came for, there is more of it here. Subscribe, and we keep going.